delighted to be here today, and thank you all for coming, and thank you very much, Demetrius, for having us here. As Demetrius said, you're probably all very well aware of Ookla. Waiting for the slides to come up, actually. Perfect. As Demetrius said, you're probably all very well aware of Ookla, and speed tests in particular are our flagship global brand for consumer-initiated network testing. And today, I suppose what I wanted to do is provide a little bit of an independent perspective on where Greece stands in an international and European context in terms of telecoms competitiveness, both on mobile and fixed. And I want to kind of infuse some new insights around things like the competitiveness of low Earth orbit solutions on the satellite side against the rest of the fixed market, and as well progress on 5G SA versus other European countries. And then we'll talk a little bit about where we see the market going from an AI standpoint and the new network requirements, I suppose, that potentially will be driven by the emergence of new AI services. So as I said at the start, you probably all know Ookla very well for the speed test brand, crowdsourced consumer-initiated testing, but we also have Kehoe Wi-Fi design and optimization, down detector like a tsunami warning system for outages in the service layer, and then Root Metrics is our controlled network testing business. And we have, billions of different daily samples in the background from our crowdsourced data, tens of millions of speed tests that are taken each day, and millions of miles that are driven. So a huge data set globally, and in particular in Greece as well. So first of all, I wanted to start off by looking at where does Greece stand today from a mobile competitiveness standpoint. Well, in the last period in the Speed Test Global Index, which is an independent benchmark of performance, Greece was 14th in Europe on mobile speed. So this is median download speed here. And we see quite positive momentum actually over the last number of years, driven by the different efforts by the operators in terms of investing in the 5G rollout, in particular obviously driven by mid-band spectrum. And as well on the actual 5G availability or 5G coverage side, Greece is quite competitive. Again in Europe, number 6 actually in the second quarter of this year, and moving up. Now of course, it's not all mid-band coverage, there's DSS there as well, and I suppose that's one of the things that I would highlight and emphasize in the context of the limitations of many of the statistics used by the likes of the European Commission and others, is that there's a focus on headline, outdoor population coverage, but maybe not so much more scrutiny of what's actually taking place under the surface in terms of mid-band coverage, DSS usage and all of that, which can have a huge impact on the end user experience. And you can see among the PIGS group of countries, I thought this was an interesting chart here, that Greece really has moved ahead of many of the countries in this same basket here over recent years. And you can see the gap has remained relatively significant throughout, but the coverage growth now is starting to slow down and level off in Greece as the higher levels of coverage are achieved. And interestingly, when we look at our data in terms of what proportion of time users are spending on the different radio access technologies, 5G now is dominant in its usage. Around 57% of the typical Greek consumer, they're spending 57% of their time connected to a 5G network. And you can see obviously a very small proportion of users on 2G and on no service. Notwithstanding that, and I'll come to that in a moment, but you can see here Greece is significantly above the European EU average in terms of the average amount of time spent connected to a 5G network. Now, of course, not all of that is mid-band 5G. There's DSS that's in there as well. But interestingly, we have seen in our data over time, those countries that have moved early on the 3G sunset, in some cases have actually had negative outcomes, in that the time spent in locations with no service or on 2G has actually gone up as a result of the premature pulling away of the 3G layer If you look at the UK, for example, one of the operators there moved very aggressively over the last 2 years to sunset the 3G network, and we've seen a significant increase in the number of black spots indoors for voice and text access because they haven't made available that spectrum yet. We're using it on 4G or 5G. And you can see here, time spent on 2G actually in Greece is significantly higher than the EU average, and that's certainly something to have a look at in terms of the impact of that. It might be difficult to see this particular slide here, but this is given an example of those countries where we see 3G still being the most commonly used access technology. You can see Moldova and Belarus stand out here on the 3G side, and in 2G there's quite a bit of use still in Ukraine, and indeed in parts of Greece as well, in the more rural provinces. So subscribers spending most of their time connected to those network generations. And this is the Europe-wide view. This is fresh off the printing press, the first time we've actually showed this. So this is looking at the speed test and background samples where we see 5G being the most commonly used technology. I think what's the striking takeaway from this is that many countries which have high levels of 5G coverage in the statistics published by the likes of the Commission actually have very low proportion of subscribers spending most of their time connected to 5G. And that may be, for example, due to tariff side limitations. So their device or their tariff profile is not provisioned for 5G access, or the 5G coverage depth is poor indoors or whatever. But you can really see the substantial gap between the northern European countries, the Nordics, for example, and some of the likes of Denmark and others that obviously have natural advantages in terms of geography and demographics, being densely populated and urbanized, versus some of those southern European countries, in particular the likes of Italy and Portugal and Spain, that have less common 5G usage. In terms of 5G SA, Greece actually is doing quite well, fifth in Europe, obviously driven by the Cosmotel early SA commercialization. And one really striking statistic to take away here is that in general, overall, Europe is really lagging in terms of SA commercialization. If we look at the global picture, in the last quarter, only 1% of all of our samples in Europe were based on SA. In the US, it was over 20%. In India, over 50%. And in China, over 80%. So you have a massive gulf and a massive gap in terms of monetization, the commercialization progress, I should say, in the context of SA, and it's very fragmented by market. And we see here, this is from Greece actually, the data we see, significant performance uptick on SA networks, only in cases where the SA network is given the sufficient capacity. We have seen some countries whereby the SA network or SA layer actually performs worse from a download speed perspective than the NSA layer because of the loss of the capacity on the 4G anchor. But this is an example of whereby sufficient capacity has been provided. And of course, the big story in the context of SA is latency and the latency benefit of the new 5G core. And we can see that tangibly in our data, about a 30% improvement actually in latency on SA connections compared to NSA. And of course, that is a particularly pertinent benefit for the new emerging applications that I'll talk a little bit about that are more latency sensitive. And interestingly, we do actually see in our data that geography and demographics are not actually destiny for coverage outcomes in Europe. So many people say, you know, well, a country has a natural advantage if they're, like I said a few minutes ago, if they have higher population density, a lower rural population share. But what we actually see is that policy factors and the market structure can actually supersede and overcome these outcomes and actually drive higher levels of coverage irrespective of those background, I suppose, barriers. And the actual prudent nature of a regulator can have a big impact on the success in terms of the level of 5G coverage achieved. This is looking at the phasing of the 5G spectrum auctions in Europe, and it's very clear in our data those countries that moved earlier on releasing spectrum have had significantly better outcomes in terms of levels of coverage. And I suppose it's a good lesson for regulators and governments there around the importance of timely spectrum release. I wanted to shift away a little bit now from the topic of 5G and from mobile, and to look at the fixed side, and to bring some data actually that I think is quite interesting in the context of Starlink and some of the other low Earth orbit solutions that are emerging, and some of the Wi-Fi trends that we see in Greece and elsewhere in Europe. We have seen the performance credentials of Starlink improve dramatically across Europe over the last year or two. This has been driven by an increased number of satellite launches, and also an improvement in the ground density network of the stations for interconnect to the internet. And you can see here, in particular towards the end of last year, the latency profile of Starlink really improved significantly, from a median latency of over 100 milliseconds now down significantly closer to 40 milliseconds, which is a big improvement in competitiveness. Obviously still a gap with your typical fixed line connection, which has an inherent advantage in the context of latency. And not just on the latency side, but download speed as well, actually. We see not only has the download speed profile of Starlink improved dramatically through these satellite launches, but also it is significantly above the actual averaged fixed line speed in Greece, which is obviously indicative of the poor level of fixed competitiveness in Greece, and the slowness in terms of adoption of fibre and deployment. And you can see here that the Starlink performance profile is almost cyclical. It moves in waves. So you can see periods whereby the satellite network capacity starts to be exhausted and speeds start to decline, and then new satellite launches then provide new capacity, and then the cycle repeats. But overall, the trend is clear, 63% higher speeds on Starlink in the last quarter compared to the average fixed connection in Greece. So it's a competitive solution. And we see actually not just as obviously Greece has challenges on the fixed side to the actual doorstep in terms of fibre access, but also there's a very much a legacy Wi-Fi base in Greece. So even for those people that have fibre, they may have old Wi-Fi CPE or routers in their home that are artificially capping fibre speeds. So a pertinent example of this, Spain is one of those countries that has very high level of fibre penetration. But when we look at the actual speed profile of Spain, it's actually not so good, relatively speaking, because they have a huge amount of Wi-Fi 5, Wi-Fi 4 devices in the router mix. So this is a point to say that, a lot of focus has been on getting the speed to the doorstep, but how do you actually bring that speed through the home, spread the gigabit wirelessly? And that is where, focus on Wi-Fi is becoming more and more important in those leading fibre markets, the likes of France, Spain, Switzerland, and others. You can see here, this is the profile by European country of the Wi-Fi base of adoption of Wi-Fi 6, 7 and 6E, and Greece is near the bottom in terms of adoption of the newer technologies, which obviously has a significant impact on speeds, and I'll show you that here. You can see this is for Greece in the last quarter. Those consumers that were on Wi-Fi 7, Wi-Fi 6E routers and Wi-Fi 6 routers had a substantially improved experience. And this holds across download speed, upload speed, and latency. In particular, Wi-Fi 7 is very much a latency story in terms of improving response times on the newer Wi-Fi CPE. And just moving towards the end of this particular deck, I wanted to speak a little bit about where we see network requirements changing over time in the context of AI, and in particular, what I suppose I call here the agentic AI era. We're in a very privileged position in Ookla to have access to so much excellent data across many, many different markets. And what we've seen is, a shifting of the discussion taking place in the industry now, where it was all about, unsustainable data traffic growth for many years, and now the discussion is actually, well, traffic growth is slowing and slowing substantially, and we may actually see in some countries the traffic profile actually to start to decline as a result of improvements in compression and things like that. There's only so many hours a day people obviously can consume video content, and there's a lot of, I suppose, uncertainty around the impact of AI on the traffic profile and on network requirements. And I suppose what we see first of all is that most of the burden will actually be on the middle mile, the east-west layer, the interconnect between data centers and cloud infrastructure, rather than the last mile access network, where much of the burden of traffic has been in recent years. This is looking at our consumer quality of experience data in Greece and looking at latency to cloud infrastructure on mobile connections, Azure, AWS, Oracle, Google Cloud Platform. And what you can see as a result of the limited hyperscaler presence in Greece relative to some other countries, there are a significant number of areas where outcomes are quite poor from a latency context. And what does that mean? Well, it means in end user applications like ChatGPT, when interacting with the voice or video model, the experience is less interactive, it's less natural. And that's something that you can feel tangibly today, not tomorrow. Today you can feel that.
That was the rain. Just to clarify something, here when we see the red, is that it's very poor, right?
Very poor, exactly.
So I don't know if you know the islands, but in Chios means that it's very, very poor.
Yes.
Chios is that island near Turkey. All right.
Yes, yes.
Just clarify that, because I think a lot of people really like. So that's because there's so many edge servers. That's the reason.
Precisely. So there's a few different inputs into the equation of latency to cloud servers. Okay. Some of the ones that we see in our data is hyperscaler presence and proximity. Yes, is a big one. So, for example, I'll give you a tangible scenario here. So we see in our data globally, Middle Eastern countries like the UAE and Saudi Arabia perform remarkably well in terms of download speed, okay? But when we look at latency to cloud servers, they actually perform much more poorly than European countries because the local presence of hyperscalers is much more limited in the Middle East.
Just to clarify that, okay, now I'm asking like a journalist, okay, so if there are too many data centers in all Greece, not just Attica region or Thessaloniki or Crete, that will make much better the experience that the people, the consumers, the users have with ChatGPT and this kind of services.
Precisely.
That's what we are saying.
Exactly.
Okay.
So what we're seeing is, yes, that the density of the hyperscaler presence, the interconnection and peering agreements between telcos and the hyperscalers themselves is becoming absolutely critical in terms of the end user experience in things like AI applications, in things like video as well, obviously, where peering has always had a big role, CDNs, all of that. So it is to say that, you know, the last few years, so much of the focus has been on the last mile access networks, but actually what's happening in the core is just as important, and perhaps more so moving forward. And to Dimitri's question there, yes, we see latency becoming a more important factor moving into the AI era in terms of access to localized inference and compute. And just moving forward, and this is a good example of why. So you take, what I'm showing here basically is the demand on the network, the utilization of the network. And with the agentic workload, as in AI agents that are now starting to emerge, the pressure on the networks is continuous in nature. So there's a very high utilization for a long period of time. So it's a step change in the demand on the network from a latency perspective. The current model today with chatbots, ChatGPT, Gemini, Mistral, whatever, the chat, are signified by the red boxes here. They're bursty, spiky chat sessions whereby latency matters just for an instant. But for these agentic workloads where there are maybe hundreds or thousands of tool calls in one agentic flow, the importance of latency actually builds up and compounds over time. So a good example of that is in this particular graphic here. So if you think about a single chat interaction with ChatGPT today, yes, latency is important, but it doesn't have a significant impact on the consumer experience because it's just one call and the AI may be only, you know, calling 2 or 3 or 4 different sources. But with an agent model where, as I said, hundreds of different sources, tool calls are required, the impact of the worst latency outcomes or the P95 latency outcomes actually increases super linearly, which could have a substantial impact on the end user experience. And what we are seeing from leading telcos now globally is around this idea of actually productizing latency and SLAs around latency to actually monetize that so-called agentic interconnect. So for operators to optimize your infrastructure to better interconnect and peer with the likes of your Google Cloud Platform or Azure or whatever. But yeah, the key takeaway here really is that in the AI era, the focus on download and on the last mile is potentially going to decline or reduce somewhat, and that the importance of latency in the actual core to the inference, and in particular potentially uplink traffic as well, becoming more important as sensors are feeding data up to the centralized compute. And there's a lot of, I suppose, uncertainty still in terms of the impact of AI on network requirements. It will very much depend on where the compute is taking place. We don't know yet how much compute and inference will take place on device. Obviously, the Apple model with their private cloud compute and Apple Intelligence is that as much of the compute will take place on Apple silicon as possible, and some of it is offloaded then to their cloud infrastructure. So it's unclear quite yet. Some other vendors like Qualcomm have actually focused on putting some compute in the gateway in the home, in the CPE, to run some inference there. And then there's obviously others that have talked about compute at the base station level or at the fixed point of presence or POP. So there's a lot of uncertainty, but the point being that latency is becoming more and more important and optimizing networks for latency. And that's true on fixed and mobile, on mobile with 5G SA and slicing, latency aware slices, all of that. So that's just a very quick overview of some trends in the international context and in Greece. And very finally, I want just to give one closing note, and that is the biggest theme we see from a policy perspective this year is the importance of resilience. So not just speed, but how reliable and resilient infrastructure is. We see this coming from the European Commission and others in terms of potential recommendations on minimum battery backup and power redundancy in the RAN. And this has obviously been talked about in the context and in the aftermath of the blackout that took place in Spain and Portugal earlier this year. And this is our data for this. And what we saw here is that the status of the mobile network grid moved in lockstep with that of the power grid. And within 2 to 3 hours after the power outage took place, the entire mobile network grid was effectively down in Spain. No ability to call, text, access emergency services because of limited power redundancy. But there is one particular outlier to that. So this is the data for Portugal. This is plotting the proportion of subscribers that were left with no service against time. And you can see here one of the operators, Mio in blue, had significant battery backup and redundancy in their network. And as a result, much less consumers were impacted. For one of the other operators here, Digi in this case, they have a newer network in Portugal, less power redundancy. They had a lack of geo redundancy in their core, and one of the core sites went offline in Lisbon, the Evolved Packet Core. And as a result, for an extended period, virtually the whole subscriber base was left without service. So the point I'm making here again is around, designing infrastructure with resilience in mind. And this is something that we see becoming thematically more important over the next few years, and certainly over the next year. And I suppose that's the end of the slide deck. I want to thank you very much for your time. And you can find more data at ookla.com/research and connect with me on LinkedIn through the QR code if you're interested in learning more. But I appreciate your time and interest. And thank you, Dimitris, for having me.
Thanks for the game. I have told Luke that the presentation will be 15 minutes. You went over that, and I left you. Usually I don't let people like that because it was really, really interesting, and especially the part that you were saying that download won't be so much of importance, but latency and uplink, that was really interesting for a lot of people, especially from the mobile operators. Thanks very much.
Thank you.